Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I will walk you through the implementation of the API call for ChatGPT. In my app, I will be using the ChatGPT API to generate variants of an image. Most people use ChatGPT for the chat, for the text, generation of text functionality, but it also has an API to create images. I will be calling the API for my backend in AWS in a Lambda function. Let's start with the API documentation and then have a look at the source code. On openai.com, you'll find the documentation of the API. Now you see lots of different sections in this, and in particular, I want to have a look at the images section. So here you see you can create images, you can create a modification of an image, that's called image edit, or you can create an image variation. The calls to these functions are fairly similar. Let's have a quick look at them. To create an image, you send a post request to the images API generations endpoint. And you need to send a prompt and a couple of optional parameters. They provide an example request with this syntax. So you send over a text, the number of images you want and the size of the image you want. All that as a JSON. And the response will be a list of URLs where you can download your pictures. So to create an image, you send an application JSON. So that's just a JSON that you upload to the server. And you also need an API key. So that one you will need for all your calls. So you need to create an account with OpenAI, log in. You need to enter your credit card details, and then you can create an API key that you can then enter here. So authorization, bearer, and then your API key. Now to edit an image, that's slightly different. So that's the same API, but a different endpoint. You also send a post request to that endpoint. However, the main difference is you don't only send a prompt, which is a text, but you also have to upload an image. This image must be a valid PNG file, less than 4 MB, and square dimensions. The areas you want to be edited by ChatGPT, you mark as transparent on your picture. So these are the areas ChatGPT will fill based on the prompt you also need to provide. And of course, size of your response, the number of images you want to get. And you see the response is similar. You get a list of URLs where you can download the images. However, the request is very different. Of course, you also need the API key, but you notice it's not content type application JSON, but you see this -f. So what that means is the format the post request is sent is in line with the way a web browser sends a post request to a server. That is a fairly outdated model based on the 90s technology. However, the advantage is you can easily build a small web page with a form field and add each of these image, mask, all that as a field in your form and use that form to send a request to the API. Now that's really more for testing out how that works, because you don't want to have your API key on a website that is public. So you can do that locally to test it, but you want to generate a similar or basically identical request from your backend, from your server, whatever it is, but probably not a web browser, to send it to the endpoint. Now the way images, for example, are encoded in this, an image is a binary data, and HTTP is inherently bad with uploading binaries. and you potentially have multiple data fields, so you need to mix binary data from the image and other data. So you need to encode that in a very specific way. And this -f is for file in a HTTP upload. And that comes with a specific header for each field that is repeated at the footer. And everything between that will be treated as binary content. Now, this is super specific and not really used that often in server-to-server communication, but that's the way you have to call the API. Now, last but not least, that's the one we really want to look at, the image variation endpoint. Same API with the images, but the endpoint is called variations. And here you just upload an image and all other parameters are optional. So you do not have a mandatory prompt. You just can give a number, an integer, for the number of image variations you want to get created between 1 and 10. You request the size of the images, which is also optional. And you can request a response format, which is also optional, and default is a URL. That means you get the URLs of the pictures. Alternatively, you can request a byte64 encoding. If you have 10 pictures, that might be very, very large, but you get it directly and you don't have to open multiple connections to the servers. I chose to go with the default and get the URL and then individually download the images myself. User is an optional field and can help you to segregate billing-wise the calls from your different users of your app. So also here they provide an example. Again, you have to upload a binary field plus other contents. So that is in the specific HTTP upload format. And of course, you need your API key again. Result, always the same. It's just a link of the URLs of the images that were created. So one last side note here, the response takes roughly 10 seconds. So you need to keep your post connection open for about 10 seconds to get the URLs. And after that, you need to download the files. So end to end, it will take more than 10 seconds to get the images on your server. So with all this said, let's have a look at my sample implementation of the calls to this API that I have done in NodeJS 16 in AWS Lambda. So here's my AWS console showing the source code of that Lambda function that calls the API. Now the first thing I would like to highlight is I have under Node modules quite a lot of functions from OpenAI, and all these functions are needed to facilitate the upload of the image in the right format with the right wrapper and everything as the API needs it. So that is from the OpenAI website, so you can download it from there, use a package manager to download all that, and then deploy it in your AWS environment. So what this function does is it first reads from a DynamoDB table a list of work items of images that need to be sent to the API and processed over there. So it takes the first item of that list and executes this code for that. So the first thing I do is read the binary file from my S3 bucket where I have placed that beforehand. As specified in the documentation, it's a valid PNG file with square dimensions. Then I update some tracking information, so if this function is executed in parallel, it will not be processed twice. And here the generate variant function is what actually calls ChatGPT. So let's have a closer look at that one. So here's a function that actually calls ChatGPT, generate variant. I prepare some configuration, meaning mostly the API key. I load the OpenAI and initialize it with my API key. So with that, here I generate the OpenAI API representation in my function. And then I can use it with my API key that I have set in here. The OpenAI API class has the function create image variation, which takes post data, the number of variants that I'm requesting, and the dimension of the output. So post data I first need to create, and then I do up here. So post data is the binary content of my PNG file, and I add the field for the name, file name, doesn't really matter, but it's required. So I have that in order to hand it over to my image variation. And here it takes about 10 seconds or so to receive the response. And then I get under response data the variance, and I can loop over these URLs. In this case, I only take the first one because I'm requesting only one, so it's not properly a loop, but you see how it works. And I get the URL, then I take the URL, and I download the URL with this receive from URL function and get the binary data of the response file. That I return to the caller of this function, and there it can then be stored in a S3 bucket again. And just in case you need this kind of code, this is where I retrieve the actual data from the URL. So a remote URL is handed over, and I open an HTTPS GET connection to that URL, download the data, and save it in a buffer, and then return that buffer. And after I receive the files from ChatGPT, I can store them in my S3 bucket and have them available via HTTP from my bucket, which is wired up to a domain. And the rest is just inventory management, tracking the progress of all this execution in my app. Now, one last thing that is important to mention. A Lambda function in AWS has a timeout, and that must be configured long enough to facilitate everything that needs to be done here. So I believe the default timeout is only 3 seconds. Obviously, that's less than the 10 seconds I need to wait to get a response from ChatGPT. So I set it to 45 seconds. That is more than enough to send the data over, wait for ChatGPT, retrieve the files from the response, store them in the bucket. So that's more than enough. The memory I set to the lowest possible value. It doesn't need much memory, and I'm charged by the memory and the runtime of the function. Now, keep in mind, this is not the only timeout that is configured for a Lambda function. This one is for the Lambda function itself. If you call a Lambda function from the API gateway, the API gateway has a separate timeout. So if you have that set up, you need to make sure both timeouts are sufficient to facilitate the execution of the call to ChatGPT. So this is an example implementation of how you can call the ChatGPT API. So you can play around with it a bit. You can create a tiny website that has a form with these fields that does everything, or you build the code in your application already. And you can upload pictures and get the response. Can be a bit entertaining. Maybe you find a way to actually make that useful. For me, it's more like a play around thing, the image API, or you find a way to combine that with something more useful, maybe the chat version of the API combined with the image variants or the image creation version to come up with something that is fun, entertaining, or useful. If you have any cool ideas on how to use it, I would love to hear them in the comments below.